2024 coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little black subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that black subscribe button. Really does help our audience grow, really does help our channel grow, really does help and mean more than you could possibly know. So go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Also, thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet 50 on any game, get $250 in free bets. Thank you again to Betfred. Thank you again to you. Now, here's the video that you came here for, right? Because over the last couple weeks, I would argue that probably the number one piece of criticism that I've gotten, and listen, I'm as guilty of not being perfect as anybody else, but it's been, Torres, you're talking way too much Kentucky basketball right now. And on the one hand, I get it. Most of you are not Kentucky fans. Many of you are, even some Kentucky fans, like you're talking too much. On the flip side, there's a lot going on in Kentucky and not a lot going on anywhere else. In college football, everything's set, right? Guys are back on campus working out, getting ready for the Labor Day weekend, start of the college football season. But even in college basketball, like rosters are essentially set in every single place except for probably the biggest brand, the biggest name in college basketball in Kentucky, where they just added an 8th scholarship player this week, meaning that they still have, in theory, 5 more players that they could add this offseason at a time when the portal is basically done, as is the class of 2023. So there is a lot going on at Kentucky, and that doesn't even include, all of the stuff that we've talked about, not just the roster turnover, but the NIL situation, starting a collective this week. So again, a lot going on. And really, I think John Calipari and his crew was kind of hoping, okay, it's going to be a quiet few weeks. We're going to add a few pieces. Everything is going to be okay. Unfortunately, the exact opposite happened on Friday because Kentucky, I'm not exaggerating when I say, I think they may have gotten the worst possible piece of news that they could have at this time on the calendar right now, this moment in time that they could have. That is that Aaron Bradshaw, one of their many McDonald's All-American 5-star players. Remember, the whole reason that Kentucky fans want you to believe that, and I'm not even criticizing Kentucky fans, but the whole reason, the whole narrative of why Kentucky has struggled in the portal is because our freshman class is so good, nobody wants to come in and be a backup to the star players that we brought in the freshman class. Well, Aaron Bradshaw, 7'1" center, done deal starter, no doubt about it. It was announced on Friday that Aaron Bradshaw, the 7'1" center I just mentioned, according to Shams Charania, has suffered a foot fracture, and he is now expected to be out 4 to 6 months going forward. So when I tell you this is the worst possible news that Kentucky could have gotten at the worst possible time, I am not exaggerating. There is a lot to peel back. There is a lot to discuss. First of all, for those of you who are not Kentucky fans, just, the quick rundown. Again, Kentucky signs the number 1 recruiting class in the country, essentially 4 top 10, top 15, 5-star caliber players. But I would argue that while DJ Wagner and Rob Dillingham, both guards, Justin Edwards, a wing, while they're all very talented, I would argue that Aaron Bradshaw is probably the most important to what Kentucky was going to do this year. 7'1" center, elite athlete, elite rim runner, finisher at the rim, a guy that I think over time is trying to develop that kind of mid-range, 3-point range kind of guy, that new age 7-footer. But to me, ultimately, he just reminds me of an old school Cal, back to, big guy, right? Like if you remember the glory days under Cal, he always just had a difference maker at the 5 spot. And I know there's talk he's not going to be a 5, he's more of a 4, whatever. You had, in the old days, Nerlens Noel, Anthony Davis, Willie Cauley-Stein, Karl Anthony Towns. And I understand, I'm not saying this kid is going to be Karl Anthony Towns or Anthony Davis, but at the same time, he just looks like an old school Kentucky player when Kentucky had things rolling. Compare it with the last couple of years. We all love Oscar Tshiebwe, but what was the big conversation about Oscar Tshiebwe? By the end, it was pretty clear what his limitations were. This guy was supposed to be the elixir, the anecdote to Oscar Tshiebwe. Incredible college player, not criticizing Oscar, but this was the 7-foot NBA prospect, all that good stuff. And now, poof, just like that, he is out for a minimum of 4 to 5 months. The bad news, it's that, and I think this is where it gets interesting, is that this is, again, why I call it the worst possible thing that could happen at the worst possible time. There's just no way to replace that, right? Because think about it. if something, God forbid, happened to one of your guards or one of your wings, you can probably still go out and find somebody serviceable, either in the portal, high school player, whatever, that can come in and at least be serviceable. And I know that Kentucky is currently recruiting a backup big named Somto Cyril. And if they get him, that's great. But that kid is being recruited. That kid was being recruited to kind of be like an 8 to 10 minutes, essentially a backup to the backup, the kind of guy that would come in for 4, 5, 6, 8 minutes a game, commit a few fouls, get a few rebounds, help you out in a pinch. Well, now, even if you get that guy, there is just not that much out there and there's not that much depth. And so without this Aaron Bradshaw kid, Kentucky's front court is essentially this. They have a former redshirt freshman, Ugonna Onyenso Kingsley. We've talked about him many times. Really, very high upside, but he basically redshirted last year, appeared in one SEC game the entire year. And that is really, as of right now, basically the entire front court. Now you have some really talented guards. You have some really talented wings. You added another really talented wing in Jordan Burks earlier this week. But you basically had 2 guys for the 4 and 5 spots. You might be adding another guy as a backup. Now the backup is going to have to, 1, commit, and then 2, come in and play a big role. And then you still have to find guys for this role going forward. And so that's what I think is so interesting. And this is what goes to what we discussed all offseason. Listen, I'm not going to do the whole spiel about Calipari's approach to the portal. I thought he was too slow, too whatever, to this, to that. But while I feel bad, certainly for the kid, and I feel bad for the program, this is also why you don't wait until May and June to figure out the backup plan to the backup plan. This is why you hit the portal early. This is why you find guys that are willing to be reserves, come off the bench, be a 6th man, compete for the starting spot. I know that Kentucky fans want to tell me that no transfer anywhere wanted to come play for them. I just don't buy that. I just don't buy that Kansas can figure out a way to get transfers into their program, but Kentucky can't. Duke has a loaded freshman class, has returnees coming back. They have really not this year figured out the transfer situation, but in the past, they have found role players in the portal. Those guys were there if you were willing to look and willing to broaden your horizons and broaden your nets. You didn't either. And now we're in a situation where you're back down to 7 healthy scholarship players going forward. The good news, I guess the good news, if there is any silver lining at all, it did happen right now in June. There is time to, 1, listen, you go up to that Ugonna Onyenso Kingsley kid and you say to him, look, man, you've been waiting for your chance. This is it. We got nobody else. It's time. It's go time. And I do think the good news is, 1, you get that kid reps. Kentucky does have a summer tour this year. But then 2, with Aaron Bradshaw, I think the best case scenario is, in theory, he could be back, maybe not for the start of the season, but he could, in theory, be back Thanksgiving, December 1, and maybe you move past this and maybe other guys get reps. I think the concern, and it's something that I have seen a lot from Kentucky fans on Friday morning and afternoon when this news broke, I also think we have to work with the possibility that this kid might just not come back at all. Because this is something we have seen increasingly in college basketball over the last couple of years, is that a guy gets hurt, a guy has an injury, and they don't either want to hurt their draft stock or come back and not play well and then hurt their draft stock that way. And some guys shut it down. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, and I actually think it's a little presumptuous to assume that it would. But remember, a few years ago, unfortunately, I hate to say this, but the late Terrence Clark, a former player at University of Kentucky who tragically passed away, it was that situation. It seemed like he was healthy. John Calipari was doing press conferences where he said, look, the kid's healthy. I don't know what you want me to tell you. He finally comes back, but it's too late. I know Arkansas dealt with this a little bit with Nick Smith Jr. this year. Is he going to come back? Is he not? Then he eventually does. And so I'm not here to say by any stretch of the imagination that Aaron Bradshaw isn't going to come back. But I think a lot of Kentucky fans, rightfully, understandably, are sitting there saying, I don't believe this guy's going to come back, because why are you going to rush back, hurt your draft stock, young team? If you're not healthy, you're going to be criticized. If you are healthy, whatever. The team, it's just a bad deal all around. Finally, let me say this. I know this isn't going to move the needle with most of you, because most of you either aren't Kentucky fans or your Kentucky fans that are a little bit frustrated with John Calipari, listen, Calipari deserves a ton of blame for this whole situation, for being in a situation where an injury could be this costly. I will also say this about Cal, though. I'm actually starting to feel a little bit bad for him because it feels like we are now at the point where just bad stuff is happening at the worst possible time. And it's like stuff that no one could control, right? Like I go back to even this past season. For people who forget, Kentucky's entire team in 2022-2023 was built around Shaedon Sharpe, who was for a time the #1 high school player in the class of 2022. Then he announces he's going to enroll at Kentucky early. And there's all this hoopla of, well, he's not eligible for the NBA draft. Now, I said on this show, I said he's never playing a minute of college basketball the second he showed up at campus, but he enrolls early, he redshirts, and then he bounces to the NBA. Well, he ended up being a top 10 pick. He ended up averaging 10 points per game, just under that as a rookie. But I go back to like, we all want to crush Cal about last year, 6th seed, second round loss in the NCAA tournament. If he has Shaedon Sharpe like he's expecting, like that entire team is built around, I think Kentucky's significantly better, like probably a top 5 team all year and competing for a national championship. Instead, they lose the guy that the whole team was built around. They're scrambling. They're trying to figure out roles. Cason Wallace is in and out of the lineup, et cetera, et cetera. But the whole thing was built around one guy, and then you lost him. And now going into 2022, 2023, 2024, it's kind of the same. I'm not saying Aaron Bradshaw is the best NBA prospect, the most talented player on the roster, but you could argue he was the one guy you couldn't afford to lose, and you end up losing him, and it just continues this streak of bad luck. Matter of fact, I was thinking about this, and I hate to do it to you Kentucky fans, but I was thinking it. I think you can argue over the last 5 years. You just talk about the crushing, like Calipari was the guy that early in his career, everything always seemed to work out his way, right? 2011, you need a buzzer beater in the opening round to advance to the second round of the tournament. You end up going to the Final Four. 2014, big play, end up in the Final Four. Well, think about the last couple of years. 2017, North Carolina buzzer beater knocks you out of the NCAA tournament. You had a team with De'Aaron Fox and Bam Adebayo, 2 NBA All-Star caliber players that was good enough to win you a title. 2019, I would argue if you survive Auburn, and this isn't bad luck, it's just unfortunate, but you survive Auburn, you go to the Final Four as the favorite. That was the year Auburn almost beat Virginia in the Final Four. 2020, you have a team good enough to win the national championship. That was maybe his best shot. Of course, the season is canceled. Tyrese Maxey, Emmanuel quickly go pro. And then, of course, 22-23 with Shaedon Sharpe, and now 2023-2024 with Aaron Bradshaw. Bottom line, I think it's a little early and a little presumptuous to assume that he'll never play, but this was the one injury you could not have. And unfortunately, you got it, and now it's scramble mode for the Wildcats.